Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming to the 2020 Scheidel Lecture featuring Dr. Regina Lawrence of the University of Oregon. We are honored that you can join us tonight for one of our department's most celebrated events. It's really nice to see you all. So it's a long-standing tradition since 1998. This lecture honors Professor Thomas Scheidel's lifetime of scholarship, teaching, and academic leadership by bringing distinguished scholars to the University of Washington Department of Communication to meet and engage with faculty and students who are pursuing advanced studies in the field. And a special thank you to Frances Scheidel for her continued support of this event. It really does mean a lot to our community. To introduce tonight's speaker, I will now welcome my colleague, Dr. Lance Bennett, to the podium. Lance is the department's Ruddock C. Lawrence Professor of Communication and Professor of Political Science, although we claim it for our own. So as well as the founder and director of the Center for Communication and Civic Engagement. So welcome to Lance.
Thank you. Is this picking up all the way from here? Okay, well that's convenient. So greetings everyone, I can't see you with these on. What a lovely looking audience you are. And thanks for coming on, well, a typical February day in our fair city. I'm so pleased to welcome Regina. I love all of my former students, but I have a special place in my heart for some, and Regina occupies that place. And Regina has gone from a student who graduated in 1996, somewhere back then, and now I feel that I am a student of yours. So I love it when that kind of a transition happens. So as I said, Regina received her PhD in the political science department back some time ago. Not so far, but, and she has since become a leader in the fields of political communication and journalism. I've long been a fan of your work from your student days to date, in which time she has moved from the University of Texas at Austin, about which she has some interesting stories to tell, to the University of Oregon, but is based in Portland, as Associate Dean of the School of Journalism and Communication and the Director of the Agora Journalism Center. Regina has been Chair of the Political Communications section of the American Political Science Association. She served as the book editor for the journal Political Communication and was a fellow at the Shorenstein Center for Press Politics and Public Policy at Harvard. Regina is a nationally, and I should add internationally, recognized authority on political communications, civic engagement, gender and politics, and the role of media in public discourse and public policy debates. Her books include When the Press Fails, Political Power in the News Media from Iraq to Katrina, which I am happy to be a co-author of, and we won an award from the American Political Science Association for that book. I think if we wrote it today, it would be a little different. We might not be as critical of the press as we were back then, but that's how times have changed in the last 10 years, rapidly moving democracy. Another book of Regina's is Hillary Clinton's Race for the White House, Gender, Politics, and Media on the Campaign Trail. And to me, personally, the talk today couldn't be more timely or important, and I guess that's also why most of you are here. We're going to think about the future of journalism in a post-truth democracy. So please give Regina Lawrence a warm welcome.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Good. Thank you all for being here, as Lance said, on such an awful day. Couldn't you have all done something better about the weather? It's just going to take me 1 second to get set up here, make sure that everything's working the way it's supposed to. I think I'm supposed to turn this on, and ta-da. I'm really pleased to be with you today. I've enjoyed talking with so many of you. I had to laugh. Another former professor of mine, Jamie, who was much more smooth about this whole thing. He said, "Oh, Regina," who's introduced me, he said, "Oh, Regina just graduated just recently. Thank you. Thank you very much." And then another gentleman that I met just a few minutes ago who was commenting that instead of being here, you all could be watching the Democratic debate at which Michael Bloomberg will be making his debut. So thank you for being here instead. I appreciate it. What I'd like to do tonight is to, first of all, leave plenty of time for question and answer. And I will break about halfway through to take a couple of questions if that's helpful, so that I don't drown you with too much of me just talking. So I'd like to spend a few minutes to briefly situate the current crisis of journalism within that larger crisis of post-truth democracy, briefly identify some of the causes of the decline in journalistic authority and how that's played out in US press-state relations over the last couple of years, and then point toward scenarios for the future and suggest perhaps what journalism schools can be teaching to adjust to the new information ecosystem that we find ourselves in. Before I start that, I just want to pause for a minute to think about why I'm talking to you about journalism's crisis of authority. So boiled down, that problem is reflected in what many students have said in my classes over the years, especially more recently, that they don't know where to go for trustworthy news and information. And if you scratch the surface of those concerns, then other worries and assumptions quickly come to the fore, that they don't know who or what to believe, that every news organization, even those that they like and go to on a regular basis, has an agenda, that you can't ever really know what's true. And these are simple but profound statements. I doubt that past generations had the same encompassing sense of information uncertainty. And meanwhile, the profession of journalism, as we'll talk about a little bit tonight, is reeling. And its rambling or crumbling institutional and organizational infrastructure has been beset by economic, technological, political, and cultural challenges of all kinds. What the eminent political scientist Timothy Cook described as the institutional press is now struggling to maintain its place as an institution in the sociological sense of presiding over some area of social life that we call news. So why I care about this problem, first of all, from a purely empirical perspective, I'm fascinated by this crisis because I'm a political scientist by training. And political science is fundamentally the study of power. So the big questions for me are, can the institution of the press regain its knowledge power? If so, how? How will it do it? And if not, what other forms of knowledge power are going to come to replace it? But from a personal and professional and normative perspective, I've been on a bit of a journey. I've come to a different conclusion, or at least a different perspective about the future of journalism than I could have imagined when I was a PhD student here eons ago. I spent the first years of my scholarly career as a fairly unabashed critic of journalism. And so, for example, through my work with Lance on indexing theory, which I still treasure and think is very important, we explored how the press often operates as a semi-autonomous institution, and it often has a difficult time separating itself enough from other institutions of power to really play a fourth branch of government role. And quite often the views and the voices represented in the news are primarily those of the powerful. Presidents and parties, through effective management and manipulation of news, can effectively control the stories that we are told about war, national security, torture, and America's role in the world. And my first book, which was my dissertation, looked at how the media, in that case specifically the New York Times and Los Angeles Times, generally allowed police to control the narrative about police use of force and police brutality. And very rarely, at least when I was doing that research, very rarely do the stories and perspectives of communities of color make it into the news. Those communities that are disproportionately impacted by police and have a much more complex and fraught relationship with police. So that was my perspective for a long time. But then, as I found myself in journalism schools, teaching, doing my research, et cetera, first at LSU, then at UT Austin, and now at the University of Oregon, my perspective on these problems has deepened. Many of my interactions in J schools have reinforced my longstanding sense that standard approaches to journalism can be deeply uncritical and problematic. But I've also met many thoughtful journalists and journalism educators, as well as scholars of journalism, who are themselves critical of their field, and they're trying to change how journalism is practiced and taught. And I found unexpected intellectual companions, and I developed a new curiosity about how the profession might be transformed. And now at the Agora Journalism Center that I direct, we've been able to be maybe a little bit subversive, challenging standard journalistic routines and ways of thinking. And we've been able to support journalists around the country and beyond who are trying to practice journalism in new and better ways. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then, roughly the same time, this person got elected to the White House. And as for a lot of people, I think, that was a warning bell that has rung louder with each day since. Especially in this past year, I think we've begun to peer into a future that may be a future of authoritarianism in this country. And I, for one, am very worried about the future of our democracy. So in that context, the fate of the institutionalized press, institutional or establishment journalism, matters. The establishment press has often failed to act as an effective fourth estate, but who else but an institutionalized press could play that role? As Vladimir Putin and other autocrats have shown us, keeping a public confused and suspicious of all information, especially that coming from serious journalists, is an excellent strategy for gaining and maintaining undemocratic power. And so, ironically, perhaps for me, paradoxically, I now feel invested in journalism survival, but not in saving journalism exactly as it has existed. Rather, I'm invested in the reinvention of journalism to the extent that that's possible. And I'm convinced that many people do crave meaningful news and information that connects them to their communities, that really helps them to hear and understand stories of other people's joys and struggles and challenges, people unlike themselves. Many people are drawn to these stories, and they do want also somebody who can fact check and translate and push back against people in power. People may or may not want that information in those stories packaged in the way that traditional journalism has done it, but I do think many people want news, information, stories, facts, understanding. So if journalism is to be reinvented in an intentional and effective way, I think we need to grapple with the nature of journalism's current crisis. And that's what I want to talk about slightly more extemporaneously from here on out. So let's talk about journalism's crisis. We can begin with a now familiar, taken for granted starting place, and that is the reality of media fragmentation. I'm going to paint the current crisis, by the way, in very broad strokes, very quickly, just so we're sort of on the same page more or less as we begin our conversation. The fact that there are so many avenues, channels, platforms by which we receive news and information these days. In 2015, Kirsten Thorson and Chris Wells produced an interesting piece in which they talked about curated news flows. And they talked about how under these conditions of many channels and a dissolving distinction between producers and consumers, and these networked flows of content, that the number of ways in which we experience media varies more than ever before, that there is no one dominant pattern of content flow anymore. And so in a sense, almost the complete replacement of the notion of mass media with broad effects on broad publics. So if you think about your own favorite social media channel, if you have one, the messages that you're seeing there, any given message you're seeing, because you've constructed what Thorson and Wells call a personal public. It's there because a friend has sent it to you, or a news outlet that you like has posted it, or you've searched for it online, or a strategist has decided that they'd like you to see it, or an algorithm has decided that you might like it. And as Thorson and Wells put it, the choices of communications actors surrounding a person become constitutive of the media that she experiences. So one thing that this has meant for journalism is the erosion of the figurative gates that journalists used to guard. In my opinion, gatekeeping theory was never much of a theory, but it was a good metaphor for the basic power of journalists to decide what's news, as Herbert Gans famously put it. Journalists were uniquely positioned to draw on their editorial discretion, their access to powerful sources, their whole host of news values and biases to decide what events and information to pass through the gates to the public on a daily basis. Well, the economics of that and the social nature of that have all changed dramatically. Kevin Munger wrote a very interesting piece recently called All the News That's Fit to Click, the Economics of Clickbait Media. And he talks about how these information flows are increasingly defined by what stories are cascading through our personally curated flows. He writes that social media is the new distribution platform, yes, but also, importantly, a reputation builder, as social recommendations have taken the place of expensive investments in high-quality journalism. And so that now news organizations, who once used to be the ones to produce that thing we call news, now news is simply defined by what's getting the clicks, likes, and shares online, and that is, of course, a game that many news organizations are deeply involved in playing. And of course, during the same 2 or more decades-long period, we also had the loss of the serious news audience. Marcus Pryor wrote about this in his book, Post-Broadcast Democracy. Once people didn't have to sit through the evening news to get to their favorite sitcom, then we began to lose the people who maybe really never cared very much about public affairs information to begin with. And those people peeled off into entertainment formats, binge watching Netflix or spending hours on Fortnite or name your favorite video game. And that left behind a smaller audience, and it's a good audience because it really cares about public affairs and politics, et cetera, but it's more of a news junkie audience or a highly civically obligated audience. And it is, by definition, an audience that is more politically involved and more partisan. And what got lost along the way also was the accidental or incidental exposure to news, so that we no longer are likely to be introduced to information that we didn't in some ways seek out or invite in to our personally curated flow. Benjamin Toff and Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen published an interesting report a couple of years ago looking at how people navigate this complex information environment. And they found what they described as very limited direct engagement with the kinds of professionally produced journalism long regarded as our primary sense-making practice. And they focused especially on what they called news avoiders. And they found that news avoiders often believe that the news is everywhere, that it's ambient, that it will find them while they do other things on social media. News avoiders also tend to believe, hey, the information is out there. All I have to do is Google it. But at the same time, paradoxically, they don't know what to believe or whom to believe. And Toff and Nielsen write about how that feeling is anchored in this interconnected feelings of being overloaded with information, possessing limited media literacy or trust, and having little knowledge or faith in the political process. So one thing that's left behind is a tremendous economic disruption to the news industry. I'm sure you're very familiar with this story, the loss of circulation, revenues, jobs, and ultimately the closure or the scaling back of news organizations, especially newspapers, all around the country. And for some communities, what's been left behind are called news deserts, communities where there is maybe one or possibly no locally based organization that is producing news and information about that community for that community. So that's part of our new reality. We've just sketched a lot of forces that have been playing out over 2 decades or more in big, broad strokes. But on top of that, there's more. That all might be troubling enough, but layered on top of all that disruption, a new invasive species or set of invasive species have entered the information ecosystem. And journalism now ever more tenuously inhabits that ecosystem. And collectively, these forces have created a public culture that's come to be known as post-truth. You probably know that the Oxford English Dictionaries named this their word of the year in 2016. And you can see their definition there. We can say that post-truth is characterized simply by the increasing dismissal of science, of evidence, of facts in public discourse, to the extent where a major campaign that will change the face of Europe for years and years to come could be conducted almost entirely on the basis of completely false claims that were therefore shortly after, admitted to be completely false. The philosopher Lee McIntyre came out with a slim volume in 2018 called Posttruth, and he says that that term doesn't indicate that we're past truth in a temporal sense, like the term post-war, but rather in the sense that truth has been eclipsed, that it is irrelevant, as he puts it. And he writes that what seems new in the post-truth era is a challenge not just to knowing, the idea of knowing reality, but to the existence of reality itself. And other scholars, of course, have written about a similar phenomenon. Lucas Graves, a scholar of journalism, for example, has talked about a democratic recession in which facts just don't have the same purchase, and where the underlying norms of reasonable discourse seem to have eroded. The norms that thought that public discourse should be grounded in and bounded by some set of facts. Now, the phrase post-truth has been critiqued for good reason. It seems to imply a former golden age. We've passed out of the age of truth into the age of post-truth, and I think we can all agree that truth has never reigned supreme in our politics all the time. And it also seems to imply that nobody cares about facts anymore. And I, for one, don't think that's true. I think if you look at the growth of the fact-checking genre of journalism, if you look at the growth in traffic to sites that are live fact-checking debates such as the one we have tonight, we see that there are some number of people who care about facts, who want to understand them. But still, this phrase, post-truth, captures evocatively a sense that we've turned a corner into uncharted waters, to kind of mix metaphors. So what's brought about this post-truth? That's a huge question that we don't have time to really deal with tonight. McIntyre traces the roots of post-truth in everything from our human cognitive wiring and all of the biases that are kind of built into the way that we perceive and think and make decisions, to the public relations industries, campaigns for big tobacco and then big oil, to the prevalence of postmodernist thought in academia, as well as to the decline of traditional media. But since we're here to talk about media, let's focus on a few factors there. And most obviously, we have the new reality of polarization around alternative media. One of the most notable changes in our media system in the last decade to two is contributing to post-truth, and that is how the publicly increasingly organizes into like-minded groups tied to the habitual use of particular media sources, often outside of traditional media. The political scientist Tom Patterson has recently published a book that I recommend called How America Lost Its Mind. And he writes that it has reached the point where, although Democrats and Republicans live in the same country, their minds reside in different ones. And we can see some data points to that effect here. On the right-hand side of the screen is an infographic produced by the Pew Research Center in the last couple of years that shows a familiar story, and that is the number of self-identified conservatives who go to a single news source, Fox News, as their primary news source, and really, as you can see in the yellow chart on the bottom, don't distrust most other mainstream sources. Whereas on the liberal side, attention is spread across different outlets, most of the mainstream outlets, and the mainstream outlets are generally trusted. So that's a more familiar story. I think what's really eye-catching is to look at the figure on the left, and that is a social network map that was produced by Yochai Benkler and his colleagues at MIT right around the 2016 election. And in some ways, that's also become a familiar story. The familiar blue and red, the fact that there's a lot of traffic amongst the blue and a lot amongst the red and not as much overlap as perhaps we'd like to see. But the other thing that's notable there is the number of nodes on the blue side and the size of them. There are lots of nodes, and a lot of those big nodes are mainstream media outlets for the most part. But on the right, if you squint, you can find Fox News. But the 800-pound gorilla in that room was Breitbart, which, if you visited Breitbart or not, can only most generously be called a news outlet funded by the likes of the Mercers, etc. So I think these visuals vividly illustrate that we are not all participating in the same socially constructed reality anymore. If we ever were, we certainly aren't now. And these information subsystems increasingly correspond with our political and our social identities. And that would all be troubling enough, but now there's this phenomenon that Lance Bennett and Steve Livingston have written about, which they call the Disinformation Order. They argue that the material that's circulating in many of those alternative media networks and the ways in which those networks end up shaping mainstream information flows is especially troubling. So in terms of content, they point toward, as they put it, intentional falsehoods spread as news stories or simulated documentary formats to advance political goals. And how those are spread? Via, as they put it again really beautifully, algorithmically enabled communities of the like-minded that now exist on scales not captured by terms like filter bubbles. And who are the players? Well, these networks include not only the Mercers and the Koch brothers and lists of other deep-pocketed conservative funders, but also this involves, as they write, strategic information warfare by the likes of China and Russia in particular. Large media networks that routinely spread deception and amplify official attacks on the legacy press. And here's where things really seem to have turned a new corner. When we have elected officials, prominent politicians, all the way up to the White House, strenuously, relentlessly chipping away at the credibility and the place of journalism in our society. And as Lance and Steve write, all of this disinformation often passes through the gates of the legacy media, resulting in an amplifier effect. I would just note that journalists pass along that disinformation for all kinds of reasons, either out of a sense of responsibility to report on things that seem alarming or that the public should know about, to simple ignorance about disinformation and how it works, to sometimes, frankly, chasing clicks. But Lance and Steve describe the DAR cycle: disinformation, amplification, reverberation, as things are passed through the media network, gaining steam and gaining added credibility, and then reverberating back again through these networks. And inextricable from the rise of information disorder or disinformation order is the rise of the so-called alt-right and the resurgence of authoritarianism. Many of these disinformation networks, as they document, traffic in nationalism, anti-globalism, racism, anti-immigrant, and anti-refugee themes, and the need for strong leadership and order. And they write that Donald Trump was in many ways both a creature of and an assembler of these motley networks of disinformation. So much of what gets called fake news circulating through people's curated information flows isn't random noise, it's deliberate, it's strategic, it has specific political objectives. Whitney Phillips at Data and Society wrote a really provocative report a couple of years ago, The Oxygen of Amplification, in which she looked at how journalists had struggled to cover the 2016 election against the backdrop of all of those disinformation flows. And she writes, the bigoted, dehumanizing, and manipulative messages emanating from extremist corners of the internet were impossible and maybe even unethical to ignore. At the same time, news coverage of those messages helped make the messages and their messengers much more visible than they would have been otherwise, even when the reporting took an explicitly critical stance. So a profound dilemma for journalists that they're really grappling hard with today, and frankly, most of them are not very sure how to handle it. So the point of all of this is to say, we've experienced multiple disruptions, multiple invasive species, if you will, and what it's left us with is a journalistic crisis that's not just economic, even though the economic crisis is visible and consequential enough. And journalists often focus on that economic side because they've experienced it viscerally, right? But what's going on underneath that is the sense that facts can no longer be taken for granted. Now, we, as communication scholars, would quickly point out, we've been saying this for years, facts are embedded in frames, in ideologies, in relations of power. Facts were never decontextualized and free-floating in order to be meaningful. We can talk about that more during the Q&A if you'd like. But what this really represents is, has been described nicely, I think, by Kevin Kelly, who is the co-founder of Wired magazine. He wrote recently, the major new challenge in reporting news is the new shape of truth. Truth is no longer dictated by authorities, but is networked by peers. For every fact, there is a counterfact, and all these counterfacts and facts look identical online, and journalists are struggling with how to sort that out. But at an even deeper level, for American journalism, post-truth is terrifyingly disorienting. If journalists think that the public thinks that nothing is true or that anything could be true, that leaves journalists with nothing to bring to the table, no ground to stand on, nothing to add to public understanding. Since basically most journalists are not comfortable with the idea that they should adapt by just beginning to root for one politically polarized team against the other. And I realize the question of media bias is also very fraught. We can talk about that during the Q&A as well if you'd like. But I think this crisis is really profound. There's a very interesting book that came out a couple of years ago by Matt Carlson, a scholar of journalism. And he writes that journalists are struggling to position their practices as legitimate means for generating knowledge about the world and their organizations as the legitimate venues for this to occur. So putting all of this together and preparing for such a lofty topic as I proposed for this evening, it really leads me to the question, what is the role of journalism in post-truth democracy? And really, what can its role be? And I'd like to talk about that more, but I'd also like to give you a breather, as I've been talking at you a lot. If there is a question or two or a comment that you'd like to raise now, we could certainly do that for a moment if you would like. Anybody want to raise any questions? You're just accepting everything I'm saying? I don't believe that. Yes, sir.
The last slide with the disappearing newspapers.
This is from data collected by University of North Carolina, and they've been keeping track of newspaper closures. And I'm sorry, that's not well labeled at all, is it? I replaced this late last night. I used this one instead of a different one. So basically what they're showing is the number of closures. I believe that the recent closures, this is only the recent ones, which I believe are indicated in red. And I think the gray dots represent the number of dailies that have gone to weekly publication, although it could be the other way around, because this is a post-truth world, and so I'm not exactly sure which it is, but I would happily look it up for you. But they have a lot of great data and really good infographics on this, the economic side of this crisis. Thank you for asking. Yes?
So you talked a lot about how there's a distinction between liberal and conservative people out there who are making news. But like when I heard that, I thought, well, it's that maybe because older people tend to be more conservative and have, understandably less sort of internet intelligence.
Great question.
And younger people are generally more liberal and have grown up with the internet and are more able to like could it be more than just a liberal conservative divide? Could it just be a familiarity with technology divide?
That's a great question. If everybody could not hear, the question was essentially, I think you were referring back, maybe this is many slides ago, maybe, where the heck did it go? Maybe that one was what got you thinking about this. And the gentleman was wondering, are these divides that are reflected here really just age divides and just reflecting familiarity and comfort levels with technology? I think that's a great hypothesis to explore further. I would quickly point out one interesting counterfactual, and that is that recent studies indicate that some of the most, some of the places where the wheels are greased for disinformation flows on Facebook in particular are primarily among older Americans, which may be, as you said, it may be a reflection of unfamiliarity, right? A kind of credulity that, finding it easy to believe whatever comes across the transom at them on Facebook. But we do know that those sharing habits among older Americans are really an important aspect of what's happening when we talk about the spread of disinformation, which may just be another way of saying what you've said, but I think it's an interesting wrinkle to consider. So great question. We can talk more about that when I can gather my thoughts and have a better, a better response for you. Yeah, great question. Anyone else right now? Okay. I will go ahead to where I was. This big lofty question, I'm not going to answer that question for you. I don't think I can. It's something I've certainly thought about a lot, but I'd like to delve a little deeper into this crisis of journalistic authority and how it's been playing out in press-state relations over the past couple of years. So in 2016, this particular Gallup poll got a lot of attention. For the first time in all the decades that Gallup had been going out and asking Americans this question, how much confidence do you have in the media? For the first time, they found the lowest ever percentage saying that they have confidence, at least some, in the media, 32%. And that 32% finding became a key focal point for journalism's sense of crisis. Of course, that's in the context of the unexpected outcome of the 2016 election as well. Now, it's important to note, historically, other polls have shown even lower levels of trust in the media, and that this is a very long-term trend, not just something that suddenly developed in 2016. This is something that Patricia Moy and Michael Pfau talked about in their book from many years ago called With Malice Toward All, for example. But still, this became a key focal point for journalists, this kind of sense of crisis and this indicator of deeper problems for them with the public. Now, the tricky thing about this crisis of public trust is the fact that it is, to some extent, a highly partisan phenomenon. And I have more thoughts about that if you'd like to discuss that during the Q&A as well. There are many sources, potentially, of public distrust in the media. Partisanship is one of them, and it's vividly illustrated when you disaggregate the Gallup trend line by party identification, as you can see here. Donald Trump has leveraged that to an unprecedented degree the deep partisan gap in media trust that was built up over decades and really built up in large part through the efforts of conservative politicians and commentators, and this has been nicely documented in a few studies as well. Now, you're probably all familiar with Donald Trump's Twitter feed and his pretty relentless, constant attacks on the media, among others, fake news, failing news media, enemy of the people, etc. And you're probably also aware of the attacks on reporters and journalists and the media at Trump rallies, rhetorical attacks from the president, and also physical attacks by some of his supporters. So in that context, the crisis of journalistic authority really got brought to a head by Donald Trump's unique approach, shall we say, to press-state relations, his unique approach to news management, bypassing the news conference, holding instead the chopper talk outside of his helicopter, announcing major policy decisions and opining constantly on Twitter decisions and pronouncements that are routinely, reversed within hours or days, suborning lies from the podium by his spokespeople, and producing himself a kind of endless stream of demonstrable untruths, relentlessly dismissing and attacking the press as fake news. All of these practices have broken really dramatically with president's usual methods of news management. So the Trump presidency has presented a profound conundrum for journalists who have struggled to really sort of figure out their footing in this new dance that Trump has initiated. You'll remember perhaps that Herbert Gans and others also talked about that dance, the symbiotic dance between the White House press corps and the White House. I would say journalists are struggling to find their footing in that now. With another scholar, Shannon McGregor, I've been working on a study of how Trump has upended the usual daily routine of White House newsmaking and how he's done that through Twitter in particular. And among other things, we find that journalists briefly, when Trump was first elected, briefly struggled with the question of whether his tweets should be treated as official pronouncements, as if they were said at the podium. But then they quickly began to routinely incorporate the tweets, not just his words, but embed the whole tweets into the news stories, thus ironically amplifying Trump's claims, his untruths, his claims to unfettered power, and his attacks on the mainstream press. I like to think of this as Trump's jiu-jitsu that he plays with the media, playing to exactly what he knows that they will do and using that to his own advantage. And the response, the showdown between the press and the new president really began to come to a head even before Trump took office. The Columbia Journalism Review published what they called an open letter to Trump just days before his inauguration. And this is an interesting example, by the way, of journalists directly engaging in what Matt Carlson calls the information politics of journalism, the power struggle, he defines it, the power struggle among competing groups seeking to define the appropriate provision of information. In a piece published in 2017, Carlson argued that journalists need to engage actively and effectively in the politics of information. He wrote toward the end of the article, if journalists will not speak for themselves, others will continue to do so. And a question I've become fascinated with is how? How can journalists speak for themselves? And how can they do that in a compelling way, particularly in this highly fragmented and polarized and disinformation-ridden environment, this ecosystem that we now all inhabit? Now, I just quickly note this little snippet from the CJR open letter to Trump leans hard into particular kinds of arguments. If you saw this quote in its whole context, you would see that they're leaning hard into the notion of gatekeeping. They're essentially saying to the new incoming president, we are the ones who will set the terms of what gets into the news, not you. We are the ones who will seek to hold you accountable no matter how hard you make it. And also, they lean hard into kind of technical competence and professionalism. We will set higher standards for ourselves than ever before. but would that approach work? And then as the conflict between the two of them continued to play out over the next couple of years, things got really interesting. In the summer of 2017, you might remember Trump's video that quickly went viral. It was a doctored video that seemed to show the President of the United States wrestling a man to the ground whose head had been replaced digitally with the CNN logo. In the summer of 2018, you had CNN's Jim Acosta, who had often been a target of Trump's ire on Twitter. He said of a Trump rally that he covered in Tampa, Florida, "It felt like we weren't in America." And around that same time, Quinnipiac and some other polling organizations went out to the field to ask people essentially if all of Trump's rhetoric about the media was really resonating for them. So Quinnipiac asked people, which comes closer to your point of view? The news media is the enemy of the people or an important part of democracy. And as you can see there, 51% of self-identified Republicans in that particular poll said enemy of the people. So that created a pretty uneasy context for journalists, as you can imagine. And that context has continued. I note that just 2 weeks ago, the Committee to Protect Journalists, which usually focuses on reporters who are covering authoritarian countries, have now issued safety kits for American reporters who are covering the 2020 election. So it was in the context of all of this, a study that I'll talk about just briefly before I conclude my remarks for tonight. In August of 2018, you may recall that hundreds of newspapers around the country joined in a coordinated editorial page effort that was loosely known as the #FreePress campaign. It was led by the Boston Globe. And with a University of Oregon PhD student, we've gone back and collected all of those editorials, and we've been examining the kinds of arguments that they made, again with this lens of how are journalists entering into these information rhetorical battles. And a few things that we found. We found that the Trump administration's highly unconventional approach to news management seems to have licensed editorial boards around the country to engage in open battle with a sitting president of a kind that I just think is unprecedented. And it really goes against key paradigms of political communication theory, perhaps, such as the indexing theory that Lance and I worked on for so long. We found that 2/3 of the editorials explicitly argued back against Trump's enemy of the people language, that 3/4 of them mentioned their editorial as part of a larger coordinated nationwide campaign. And that one really surprised me in a way, because if you think about it, if Trump is trying to box them in as the liberal media elite that are political insiders in cahoots together, you think that they might have avoided sort of signaling to the public, yeah, we are doing this together, we are fighting back against the president together. But 3/4 of them did. Over 1/3 of these articles, moreover, explicitly describe Trump as an authoritarian or in related terms. On the other hand, we find that about 1/4 of these editorials avoided naming Trump whatsoever, even though they took part in the editorial campaign. And we found, not surprisingly, that those patterns tend to coincide with voting patterns in the localities in which the newspapers were based. So an interesting paradox, since many of them leaned hard into arguments about objectivity and nonpartisanship. Very few of these editorials acknowledge the deeper roots of the public's distrust in media. Very few of them even acknowledged that trust in media had been declining for quite a while. It was as if trust or distrust in media sprung up in 2016 and was entirely Trump's fault. And most of them leaned into these arguments, again, around technical competence, professionalism, etc. And most simply asserted journalism's unique place in the American system of government as a given, as if Americans ought to know it and didn't need to understand or think about it any further. And again, I wonder, will that be enough? Is there enough? Is there anything that rhetorically journalists can do to try to reestablish their waning institutional authority? So I'll just quickly conclude, because I promised that I would. I'll sketch very quickly a couple of possible scenarios for the future, talk very quickly about some things that I think journalism schools could consider teaching, and some interesting journalistic innovations that I think are promising and interesting, or at least worth talking about. So to sketch 2 very quick scenarios, especially when I think about the national media, I wonder this. Are the enabling conditions for trust in institutions, especially toward the media, maybe those conditions just can't be reestablished. Maybe it's too much water under the bridge. Maybe institutional inertia in the news business will stymie innovative adaptation. There's certainly plenty of research to suggest that that could be the case. Maybe the national media in particular cannot win the trust battle due to the deep polarization that's already there in the public. And maybe there are no natural limits on post-truth and information disorder. And if that's all true, then maybe national news outlets in particular face a stark choice: how to adapt to the realities of a permanently polarized audience and entrenched distrust. But there is a second scenario that I like to play with as well. It's a little more hopeful. It may only apply to local media. It may be, especially for public media, I think, and nonprofit media, because their kind of incentive structures are a little different. There's some really interesting experiments happening in local journalism all around the country. And studies suggest that when the news gets nationalized, that's when this polarization, et cetera, really sets in. So Joanna Dunaway and Joshua Darr published an interesting piece a couple of years ago in which they studied communities in which the local newspaper or news outlet had closed, like we talked about at the beginning of my talk. And what they found there was that information levels decreased and civic engagement levels, voting, decreased as well. Because what happened, people replaced their daily news from their local organization with this national news, which is more partisan or at least more polarized, right? It's covering that more polarized scene. And the study concluded that local residents are less informed, less engaged in their communities in cities where polarized national news sources end up replacing the shuttered local newspapers. But I wonder, is the reverse also true? When local journalism is robust, is it possible that then people can begin to see local journalistic organizations as places for helping to address a community's problems? Can they actually see the media in a helping role to make communities better and stronger? And there's all kinds of interesting experiments along these lines going on around the country right now. I'll quickly shout out a couple. KPCC, the wonderful Ashley Alvarado, is taking her community engagement editor role so seriously to build relationships that are deeper and more trusting than they've had in that community, particularly with communities that have routinely been marginalized and misrepresented in mainstream news. And by the same token, over here we've got Cap Public Radio, Jessica Maria Ross, who's doing amazing work with connecting people with each other around and across lines of difference, using a kind of story circle methodology of bringing people together for conversations. Along very different lines, in Chicago, you may have heard of City Bureau, which is taking citizen journalism to a new level by training citizen journalists to fill the news and information gaps that are being left by local news media, and particularly with an eye toward what, again, underrepresented communities want and need to know. And I finally, is Ann Hillman here tonight? She said she might be able to attend. She's not here. This is a photo of Ann. We had the privilege of working with her and a lot of other projects when she was at Alaska Public Media. And this is a photo taken from a story circle event that Ann created there, which brought together members of the community with people who were incarcerated, who were soon going to be released into their local communities, to create dialogue between them to better understand what was that transition going to look like, and how could we help really bring people back into the community in a meaningful way. And there's something about this image that really sticks with me, because I don't think Anne planned it this way, but it really symbolizes a different way of thinking about what journalism can be in relationship to the public. Notice what Anne is doing. Instead of kind of towering over, sticking a microphone into somebody's face, and kind of that asserting that position of power to tell their story, she's seated, head down, holding the microphone up, so that this woman can be heard and heard by other members of her community. And I think there's something really powerful about that repositioning. So what can journalism schools be teaching? I think, first of all, I would argue that adaptation to this new information ecosystem requires more than just tech skills. I hear this all the time, that J schools are so concerned about how do we get students up to speed on all the latest apps, for example. Yes, students need to be proficient with technology. They need to be great self-teachers and self-learners, no doubt about it. But tech skills is not going to reestablish journalism's authority with the public, nor will doubling down on just the facts. And many in journalism do believe that that's the way forward. I disagree. Ann Curry, for example, the famous broadcaster, I have a lot of respect for her. She did a TED Talk a couple of years ago, got a lot of attention, and that was her argument. How do we face this moment of distrust from the public? We double down. It's just all about the facts. I don't think just the facts is going to be enough. I think J schools, for one, can be teaching listening. They can be teaching that posture that Ann takes of carefully listening to what people are saying. Ironically, a lot of journalism schools don't actually teach listening. They teach you how to tell a story, but not how to listen for the story. Here I would recommend, if you haven't read it, a wonderful essay by Amanda Ripley, a longtime journalist herself, who set out to understand the listening better. And I guarantee you, it will make you think. And finally, I think J schools can be teaching how to reposition journalism in relationship to the public. And at the Agora Journalism Center and at other organizations around the country, that kind of work is going on. So my wonderful colleague, Andrew de Bagal, has produced 2 seasons now of a podcast that we call Listeners, where he interviews people who listen for a living, conflict mediators, hostage negotiators, clerics, etc., and sort of teases out what are the lessons potentially for the rest of us, and especially for journalists. The Gather platform that he started with a steering committee from around the country now hosts just about 1,000 people from around the country and around the world, journalists and practitioners who want to understand how to engage more deeply with their communities. There's other organizations, I can't possibly name them all, that are doing great work. Joy Mayer, API at Trusting News Project, which is doing a lot of great research and equipping news organizations with how to build back some trust in the news by doing journalism differently. The Solutions Journalism Network, my wonderful former colleague, Catherine Thier, who's been a thought leader in that movement that's helping journalists think about how to tell stories that are focused on solutions, not just problems. There's private companies such as Harkin that you may have heard of that provides tools and consulting for newsrooms to tell stories by starting with the public's curiosity. What is the public, what does your community want to know about your community? And here's how you can go out and report that for them. So I think there's all kinds of interesting experiments going on. I'd love to talk to you more. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. So I think that we're supposed to ask people to line up and speak at the microphones if they want to ask a question. That's probably helpful for you, the videographer, I assume. So I hate to have that formality, but if you don't mind, if you'd like to go to the microphone, but if you'd rather not do that, I can repeat back your question to the audience. So I'm all ears. Thank you. Something stronger later, perhaps. Questions, comments, arguments, please, somebody. Okay, good, thank you. I thought you would.
Thanks. You touched on many of the compass points for the new landscape, like the solutions journalism, the community journalism. There are a couple of others that I'd like to, I know you've thought about. One is the issue-based nonprofit organizations that are practicing journalistic standards. More and more journalists are working for these organizations. They're trusted. They are a source of information and news. And I think we have to have a little wider peripheral vision on who can be a trusted source and where journalistic standards can be practiced. The second is, I know you've been thinking about this one, is the really alternative sources. I'm thinking this week of John Oliver's 20-minute piece on Medicare for All, which was the best explainer I've seen on Medicare for All. And he's a trusted source. So, you know, where can journalism emerge, and what are the new areas that we encourage out of the silo of journalism education?
Yeah, I love that question. Can I ask you though, the first category you mentioned when you said issue-based reporting, is that the term that you used?
For example, Human Rights Watch for the last 10 years has hired journalists who investigate human rights abuses and report on those.
Right.
That's true in a lot of climate organizations where journalists are working, where there's a sense of urgency and purpose, and it beats the local news.
news.
Yeah. There are a whole set of slides obviously missing from this presentation about exactly what you're getting at, so thank you, which is sort of alternatives to journalism that aren't nefarious, that are actually deeply committed, practicing information gathering and reporting ethically, but also sometimes to rather different standards because they may not be constrained by standards of objectivity, which can be a good thing, right? It can free them to be harder hitting, for example, in what they say. So I think you're absolutely right. This information ecosystem that we tried to kind of sketch out tonight has to prominently include NGOs and others that are adding materially, substantively to what we understand about the world. They're just not calling it journalism per se, but they're using many journalistic skills. Is that fair to say? And then I think you're right, certainly in my own mind, we have to add the likes of the late night TV shows. I didn't even mention them, which is so funny because if I had given this talk like even 5 years ago, don't you think there's like a whole cottage industry in political communication research on late night TV and the way it has come to serve as an information source that demonstrably can improve people's understanding of stuff that's happening in the mainstream news, right? So I absolutely agree, didn't leave them out for any reason except just time of getting through this presentation. But I think you're right, and I love that you use the phrase explainer. It's something that we emphasize in our multimedia journalism program, for example. Explanatory journalism is one of the foundational courses that students have to take, and they have to learn how to make a short video to explain an issue or a problem. And frankly, John Oliver might be a neat example of that, right? Because he makes it entertaining and easy to absorb, right? So I'm glad you raised that.
Doesn't dumb it down.
Right, without dumbing it down. Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really good point. Yes, looks like it's you. You're on.
Hi, Dr. Lawrence. But anyway, thank you so much, first of all, for giving this really enlightening talk. I just want to know your professional opinion about the emergence of automated accounts surging all over social media and constantly retweeting and liking. Like you mentioned something about social media being like this disruptive force and it being a reputation builder for whoever tweets it. So I just want to know what you think about the bots, like
The bots. What do I think about the bots? I think that I don't understand them. I think that's the honest answer. My wonderful colleague Seth Lewis at the SOJC is actually one of the leading, researchers in this area of AI and the intersection between AI and journalism. So I wish I could. What's that phrase from the reality show? Like, can I have a line? Can I have a call? Can I have a? If we could dial him in right now, I'm sure he'd have something really smart to say. I'm afraid I don't, because it's not something I honestly know very much about. So how's that for an unsatisfying answer? If you want to ask a different question, I'll try to do
It's
that.
okay. No, I'm totally okay with that.
But it's good. I'm glad you raised it. It's super
Yeah.
important.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence, for speaking with us today. I have a question about, so we know, like the last person mentioned, we know that foreign interference exists in our foreign interference exists in our disrupting our democracy and contributing to misinformation. But what is the role of domestic journalism in maybe shaping public perception of public perception of threat, maybe to our ideological opponents, whether that's controlling misinformation or maybe perpetuating fear? What was the role in maybe domestic journalism in that?
That's a great question, if I understand right. So I'm going to offer an answer, and maybe it'll be what you were asking, and maybe it won't, so you can tell me. One book that I have found really helpful in this regard is Kathleen Hall Jamison's book, Cyber War, I think I'm looking at Lance. Cyber War, I think it's called. And the subtitle is like, yeah. And it's just a wonderful kind of exegesis, if you will, if that's the way you say that word, of how the 2016 election played out, how the data dump from WikiLeaks, et cetera, was then poured over extensively by the mainstream media, becoming one of the prominent story themes of the election. Again, jujitsu, right? The folks who did that knew full well that journalists would find that irresistible. The secretive, manipulative Hillary Clinton and her hidden cache of emails, and now we're gonna get to find out what she's really all about, right? And it was one of the major stories. And so Jamison writes in that book very straightforwardly about how mainstream journalists had as much to do with the way the 2016 election went down. With respect to the role of Russian interference, mainstream journalists, she argues, had as much to do with it as anybody. I don't know, was that what you were asking?
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Hi.
Hi. My question is, in this post-truth era, what is it that makes an organization a news organization? Do you think Fox News is a news organization? Do you think Breitbart is a news organization?
Oh my goodness, I was afraid you were going to ask me that tricky definitional question. You notice I managed to talk for like many, many minutes and never define for you what I meant by journalism, right? Because that's really fraught, especially when you're talking to an audience of communication scholars and journalistic educators, right? So what I tried to focus on in my comments tonight is what I would think of as sort of the establishment or institutional press. And that's kind of slippery on my part, right? Because then I guess to just say, well, those are the media that have been around a long time, right? It's like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and the 3 major networks and all of that. So things automatically got harder for us once cable news became such a thing. And it's especially interesting with respect to that question of public trust in the media. You may or may not remember that a few years back, the Pew Research Center thought to actually ask people, when you're thinking about the media, what are you actually thinking about? And they, had people choose from specific nouns. And what they found was a plurality of people were thinking about cable news. That's what people associated with the media. So that gets more complicated right away, right? So I think that there is serious journalism that happens on cable news, and there's a lot of other stuff that happens there as well, in my opinion. But then I think you asked about one other site or one other, Breitbart?
Breitbart.
Oh boy. I can't bring myself to call that journalism. I just can't. Because I'm sorry if I'm sounding like incredibly old-fashioned, but I do think there's a sense in which journalism has to be based in some sense of wanting to, and having a methodology for rooting out facts, right? I mean, that has to be one of your primary goals if you want to call yourself a journalist, and I don't think that's what Breitbart is about. But that's easy for me to say from where I stand. Thanks for that hard question. Anybody else? Yes, please.
So my question gets at finding the big chunks of money. So like looking at reviving the model of the Cable Act, cable franchise agreements for cities and counties to get 5% of gross revenue from a cable company. And these companies have gotten very smart. For internet service providers, they've cut that off. The 5G rollout will not include a public interest component. But what if we pushed back on that use of our public right-of-way so that communities could get a percentage to serve our information needs?
Mm-hmm. I'm in favor of that. I don't have anything more interesting to say on that, I'm afraid, because it's not really my area of study. But I didn't even know that. So the new 5G is being rolled out without this public interest or public service component to it, you're saying?
It'll actually cost the public about $2 billion at this point.
Perfect.
Yeah.
They've really perfected these business models, haven't they? Yeah, what a shame that we're having to pay for news and information that can be the lifeblood of our communities. Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have something
Thanks.
more
That's okay.
earth-shattering to say. Any other questions? Oh, good. All right, so I'm trying not to picture myself sitting in the classroom.
Okay, this is not working, so sorry about the recording.
You can project.
I can project, yes, I can. So my question is about the role of journalism and kind of saving journalism. It sounds like the positive news is this community journalism projects that are sort of popping up everywhere, and it sounds wonderful and meaningful and important. And indeed, in this polarized time, community is something that we're losing. So that's one area in which journalism can be very meaningful for people. But I'm not sure what the political role of that sort of journalism is. And so that if I go back to the beginning of your argument, what I kind of heard you say, which I have to agree with, unless if I heard you correctly, is that journalism has traditionally reported information produced by institutions. And when institutions are credible, journalism is credible. And as institutions have declined in trust journalism has endured. There are lots of trends that show that as Congress began to be in the 5 to 10% range of trust and confidence, journalism followed that trend line fairly clearly from the 80s to date. So if we're thinking about how to restore journalism, shouldn't we be focusing on restoring democratic institutions? And journalism would take care of itself in that case. Now, I realize that few of us know how to do that, but I wonder if the dilemma that you posed for us is that the problem is not so much with journalism, the problem is with the decline of democratic institutions, which we all know as political scientists. Elections are less representative than they were 20 years ago. Representation skews heavily toward upper classes and negatively at the bottom of the economic ladder. And so what you end up with is this sort of institutional corruption, and there are other forms of that corruption as well. So what do you think of that?
I think that's an excellent question. I'm honestly really glad that you asked it, because there's even within me, as I tried to talk about in my opening comments, there's kind of a schism within me in terms of how I think about this stuff, because my political science brain isn't convinced, quite frankly, isn't fully convinced about this community journalism. Like, my journalism scholar side says that's something that news organizations really need to try, especially at the local level. So you kind of helped name that schism and what's lacking in some of the engagement journalism works. I have a multi-part answer, thanks a lot, to the question. So on one hand, I think you're right. One of the ways that plays out is that all of this engagement journalism that we really emphasize and support at the Agora Journalism Center, as much as I believe in it, and I think it's super important, it has not yet really grappled with how to simultaneously be that much more engaged member of the community, if you will, and still be a watchdog on the powerful. That's a very hard balancing act. So typically what we say to news organizations is, not everybody in your organization needs to be going out and doing story circles and other things to build community. You still need to have investigative journalists, and they may or may not need to use those kinds of methods, right? Because they're gonna have to still be tough and hold people's feet to the fire. So that's part of what you were getting at. But you're right, the larger problem of journalists' crisis of authority really is at some level. Remember I said there's more than one reason. It's not just partisan. It's not just the drumbeat of criticism, particularly on the right, that's driven down credibility and trust in news media. It's also, and I used to have a slide before I cut it, if you look at the trend lines in trust in institutions and track that against trust in media, and it's essentially the same line, as you pointed out. So it's all gone downhill together. And I'm super interested in this, because you're the one who taught me, and you and I worked so much on this together. Journalism has traditionally, at least in the US, gained a lot of its authority from being in proximity to power, to being kind of the ones who get to sit not at the table, but near the table, right? And hear and see and report on for the public what's happening in the halls of power. And that kind of institutional position has bolstered simultaneously institutions' authority and journalism's authority, right? They kind of mutually constitute each other through that daily ritual of newsmaking, and you can see this especially in the White House. So one thing that Trump is doing with his really unconventional methods is he's, like he's done in so many things, he's burning down the House. He's burning down those routines that have helped constitute the credibility of journalism. That's at a surface level, and the deeper institutional problem is there, as you mentioned. This is something that Matt Carlson writes about that I think is really interesting. I decided not to put it in the talk because it's a little bit complex, but he essentially argues there's this sort of fine line of internality, externality that journalism has to walk. And it has to, at least in our setting in the United States, our expectations for journalists is that they are not purely political insiders, and they certainly can't be partisan. They're not supposed to be, right? But at the same time, they can't be wholly outside of politics because they get their authority from being there, right? From being near the table where powerful decisions are being made. And so he argues that journalists have always sort of tried to manage this, and what's really tipped out of balance, I think, these days, is that underlying institutional credibility isn't there. And he argues that when that goes out of balance, that journalism gets pulled into politics in a way that it can't defend itself against. And I think that's it's elusive, but I think that's part of what's happening now, right? I think they're being pulled into politics, and some organizations and journalists are resisting it, and others, frankly, I think perhaps the Washington Post fits this mode that is just saying, you know what, game on. If this is what it's gonna be, if it's gonna be warfare, then okay. We're on the side of journalism, right? as we've practiced it. So that was a rambling response, but I think that the crumbling institutional underpinnings is an essential part of the story that has to be mapped onto everything we talked about as part of it, along with the partisan decline in trust. Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so my question concerns the perhaps positive potential of the phrase post-truth in terms of perhaps opening kind of space for epistemological discussions that were only kind of the kind of domain of the powerful or the elite or the ivory tower perhaps in the past, and now maybe there's an opportunity to engage with a broader public in terms of those epistemological discussions, but I'm not sure the public is ready to have that discussion, and I just wonder if you could comment on the sort of positive potential of this crisis. In addition to, say, community-based journalism that you discussed, is there a kind of a broader social potential change here?
That's a great question. Could you tell me a little bit more, like when you picture the broader public conversation that might be possible now because of post-truth, what are some of the kinds of things that you imagine that you think of?
So I'm thinking to myself, it's one thing for journalists to be self-critical, and it's one thing for scholars to critique media bias. But when everyone can critique media bias, and when everyone can talk about, well, how do we really know what we know? How do scientists know what they know? How do doctors know what they know? How does everyone know what they know? That could be a very valuable set of conversations for everyone to have, even as our trust in institutions declines. Perhaps our trust in ourselves and in our ability to discern information could increase, or some other sort of positive outcome of that broad epistemic discussion.
I think of, and again, this is going to be hopelessly pragmatic compared to the lovely question that you asked, but two kinds of examples come to mind for me that I think are along the lines of what you're talking about. For example, I think the surprising outcome of the 2016 election and then those low trust numbers, et cetera, prompted many news organizations, many journalists to really begin thinking differently about the country and about communities around the country. And I think the unthoughtful, uncritical version of that is just simply, all right, so we got to go cover those Trump voters, and or how can we get them to like us, right? I don't think that's very thoughtful and interesting, but I have seen some organizations really say, you know what, we're going to hire reporters and we're going to put them on the beat of covering Rust Belt communities, which get overlooked in the news all the time. Now, I know that's way more pragmatic than what you were talking about, but I do think this destabilization, I think is what you're saying, is that it does allow things to kind of blossom that might not have before, right? So that's one example. Another really interesting example is the way that something in what you said triggered me to think of this. There's a real movement now in many of the organizations that I showed on the screen around transparency, essentially showing your work. How do you know what you know as a journalist? Well, stop keeping that a professional secret. Make it public as much as possible. So the Trusting News Project that I highlighted, for example, this is one thing that they work with newsrooms to do. Like, be transparent, show your work. Tell your readers why we wanted to cover this story, who we talked to in order to do it, how we sort out what claims are true or false, what documents we read in order to better inform our reporting, and through that, hopefully getting us all on the same page a little bit more, right? A little bit of respite from post-truth ultimately, right?
Yeah.
So I think, to me, those are some really interesting responses to that destabilization that's going on.
Great.
Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
I thought that was a great comment and response. I do think there's an intersection between solutions-oriented journalism and listening.
Yeah.
Two of the points you made. And you think of Florida, where the water's coming up through the limestone, and you had a governor recently who would allow any government employees to use the word climate change or global warming. So I think being responsive to lived experience and what people are going through, and looking at that through a solutions lens, kind of does make community journalism very political.
Makes it political, you said, because inevitably then you're talking about, well, whose solutions really have the best chance of working? That's one question that you would explore.
It's going to solve the problems
That's a really
we're
good
facing
point.
every day.
Yeah, and having been a longtime critic of this norm of objectivity and the ways that it plays out in false equivalence and positioning the news too close to those in power because that's the safe ones to be objective about, et cetera. So my critical self says, if all of that practice of objectivity more or less goes by the wayside because of this destabilization, I'm not sure that's a bad thing. Can we find new and smarter ways to do really searching, nonpartisan kinds of reporting, but we don't have to observe those same old routines? I, for one, think that would be a positive development. Yes?
More nitty gritty, you put up a map of the news deserts of
Yeah.
the United States. Given the Electoral College and the 2020 elections likely to turn on Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, how healthy is local news in those areas, and what's anybody doing about that?
What is anybody doing about that? That's a very good question. One example that comes to mind is, I want to say the Lenfest Institute, Lenfest, I think, has been funding, or am I saying that right and getting that right? They've been trying to find ways to kind of bolster experiments in local journalism, and there are a number of the News Integrity Initiative used to be doing that. Unfortunately, they've changed models and they're really not doing that as much anymore. But there are some organizations, philanthropic organizations, that are trying to kind of give that local journalism a boost again, right? And also, what I find interesting is encouraging experimentation, not just saying, oh, you lost your newspaper, let's make another newspaper, but rather, okay, what are some different forms? What are some different platforms? What are some different practices? I don't know specifically, like in Wisconsin, for example, that seems hugely consequential. The expert on that would be Lou Friedland and the team at University of Wisconsin that has been tracking civic engagement and the news information ecosystem for a couple of decades now in Wisconsin. So they would really be the experts, I think, to go to and to find out what's happening there in your state in terms of local news and information. Yeah, it's a great question. So you're kind of wondering, like, is overlaid over this map, there are certain political dynamics that could play out in the next election. Very good point. Yes?
Yeah, so thanks for a great talk. The approach to journalism of bringing in local voices definitely resonates with me, in that if there's a credibility in the journalist portraying himself or herself as the authoritative voice, or going to the institutions portraying them as the authoritative voice, neither of those are going to fly anymore. Someone in your own community might have more credibility than the official sources. So that part is all great. And bringing in the underrepresented voices, that's all great too. The challenge is, at least as I see it, is you can talk to a gay person. Not all gay people think the same. You can bring in an immigrant voice. Well, not all immigrants think the same. Whenever I see a journalist report on a political rally, and it's, well, I talked to Jane Doe and here's what she said. I talked to Joe Blow and here's what he said. My reaction is always, well, there were hundreds or thousands of people there. How do I know that the journalist hasn't just selected these voices? And if they bring in the underrepresented voices, well, maybe they talk to 100. These are the 2 or 3 that they've picked that kind of fit the journalist's narrative. So I guess my kind of comment / question is that it might well help to restore journalistic credibility, but I'm not entirely sure it deserves to restore journalistic credibility. And what would be your reaction to that?
Maybe this is one place where we can kind of close the loop on that, however, because there are really interesting experiments in engaged journalism going on that I think help address the problem you're talking about. Probably wouldn't fix it entirely. And one of those experimenting in the most interesting ways is right here in Seattle at KUOW. Do I have the call letters correct? Mm-hmm. You probably know this. They have done so many interesting public events. For example, what was I'm sorry, this is going to come out wrong. Is it called like Meet a Muslim or something? And they literally they do very diligent outreach to communities, precisely so they won't end up with that situation. So there's one Muslim person in the room to represent the entire Muslim community. So they do really extensive, thoughtful outreach, get a variety of people in the room, both Muslim and non-Muslim, and get them engaged in conversation with one another, which then informs the reporter's understanding of the Muslim community and attitudes about the Muslim community. So you're sort of, I don't know if this is the right phrase, but you're kind of crowdsourcing. You're kind of, you're creating a larger, more inclusive conversation and then using that as the basis of your reporting, rather than you thinking as the reporter, I see our students do this all the time, right? Oh, well, my friend knows a Muslim guy. You could call him, right? And then that becomes like your go-to quote in the story. And I think you're absolutely right. That's a super problematic practice. So I do think there's ways in which you can use community engagement to really learn more about the diversity in all kinds of ways of your own communities.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, sure. Yes.
So I've listened to every episode of The Daily for the past year, which I don't think is a bragging right. But something that I've noticed is a lot of the times when the reporters report on the local issues, they'll send a reporter to the city, and then the reporter will complain on the podcast about how they can't get local information.
Oh.
Especially like in the case of the Boeing stuff I've noticed.
Oh,
In that case, like obviously the local reporters have all that information, and the New York Times people are like choosing not to talk to them. So I'm wondering what you think the relationship between local and national outlets is.
Ooh, super interesting. I've only heard one. I love The Daily too, I have to admit. Like, it's because, you know, if you like explainer journalism, it's a lovely example of that, I think. I've only heard one of the Boeing episodes, so I don't have the same point of reference that you have, but it sounds like your question is, even when national journalists are doing kind of good, diligent explainer journalism, they're not necessarily, once they go into local communities, they don't know the lay of the land, and they're not actually, you didn't say this, humble enough to, like, you know, reach out and draw on the expertise of the local journalists. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Yeah.
Just like what you think is the relationship, or should be the relationship between outlets like the New York Times
Yeah.
and the Seattle Times.
Good question. You know, this is a little off point, but it's really bringing to mind, I did some research back in 2012 when Twitter was becoming like the thing that reporters were using to cover politics in particular, and I spent time on the campaign trail in New Hampshire and in South Carolina, getting memories of it now, because we're at that time of year again, and I was struck by how many journalists, this was one thing that they loved about Twitter, is that it made it so much easier for them to locate the local people, the local journalists and others, but journalists especially, they were like, wow, now I can get, when I have to go to Ohio with the president, or I have to go to South Carolina, wherever, now I can find peers at the local level who are gonna know that context way more than I do. So I do think that social media has really helped close that gap, or not close it, but, you know, bridge that gap a little bit. But other than that, I'm not sure I have anything all that insightful to say. I think that it's an ongoing problem, right, of the national media sometimes thinking, well, we're the New York Times, right? So we've got all the best journalists. We've got all the resources. Sure, yeah, why not? Well, and there is, okay, here's something I can talk about. So there is also, along with this growing movement around solutions journalism, around listening, around engaged journalism, there's also a growing movement around collaborative journalism. So Montclair State University has a wonderful project that's been ongoing for a couple years, forgetting the woman's name who runs it, sorry. And they're all about, they do conferences, they do workshops, they're all about helping journalists and news outlets figure out how to collaborate more. And I know that in Portland, and we've done some of that work as well, and we've seen in the last few years, both a remarkable new willingness to collaborate, because the whole environment has shifted so much that many news outlets get it. If we don't collaborate, like, what are we holding on to? We don't uniquely hold an audience anymore because everybody's got these personally curated information flows, right? So they get that they need to collaborate more. We also found that there were still limits to that collaboration. So we put together a project around coverage of housing and homelessness. Portland has a horrible problem, as you do here in Seattle. Brought together a whole big group of about 70 people, many of whom have never met before. And the journalists kind of initially got excited because they were all in the room and they were like, wow, you know, we could even like develop an editorial calendar, and, you know, your organization could cover that story and we could cover another angle. And they kind of used this conversation to figure out what the story topics could be, and then crickets. Because when it came to actually collaborating, like sharing your scoop, sharing the story that you're working on, journalists are still, you know, they tend to be protective of that. I think the opposite model that was so exciting to see was a couple of years ago, David Fairholtz at the Washington Post, who essentially crowdsourced his reporting on, wasn't it Trump's, I see you nodding, so I'm looking at you. It was Trump's gifts to veterans organizations, I think, and maybe also the portrait, the controversial portrait that was hanging in Mar-a-Lago. And he essentially just put out the call on Twitter and said, I'm trying to find out about this portrait. Does it really hang in Mar-a-Lago, if I'm remembering the story correctly? And instantly people, well, not instantly, but it happened quickly. People who had been worked or visited Mar-a-Lago were like, yeah, I happen to have a picture of it and shared it with him, or knew more about the gifts, supposed gifts to veterans. And you'll recall, he won a Pulitzer Prize for some of that work. So that to me also was a game changer, or potentially a game changer, when the Pulitzer is recognizing, wow, collaboration online with the public and other journalists created knowledge that we wouldn't have had otherwise. Then I thought that was kind of cool, kind of exciting. Anybody else ready to enjoy some of those delicious appetizers back there if you haven't already? Okay, well, thank you so very much for having me. It's really been a pleasure.